Coruscant, the capital of the galaxy, was one of the most populous and well-known planets in the Star Wars universe. The alleged birthplace of humankind and the capital of both the Republic and the Empire, Coruscant was, as you surely know, a Eucumenopolis, planet buried under 5,127 levels of city. This enormous metropolis, galactic city, had a population numbering in the trillions and a very long history. Today, we'll be going through some of that history and sharing 10 stories from the galactic capital.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
We're going to start in the unfathomably distant past, long before Coruscant's original surface was buried under Galactic City, before the planet was called Coruscant even. In these ancient days, 200,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, the planet's name was Neutron, and it was a much different place. It was a habitable but chilly world, the sixth from its star, and in ancient times, it was a fairly ordinary habitable world dominated by oceans and verdant continents. It gave rise to not one, but two indigenous sentient species known to history as the Tongs and Gels. The Gel were flat-faced humanoids, numerous and industrious, and over the course of their history, they banded together into 13 nations, which formed an alliance from Neutron's largest city, the metropolis of Great Gel. The 13 nations may once have been rivals, but they eventually banded together against the Tongs, pooling their resources to create a grand army, the battalions of Gel. The Gel's planetary neighbors, the Tongs, were less numerous, but on an individual basis they were tougher and typically fiercer in combat. The Tongs were also humanoids, with grey skin, bony forehead ridges, and sharp claws, and their society was divided into warrior clans which honored strength and glory in battle. Such battles were, more often than not, fought against the Gel, and as these two civilizations advanced and expanded across Neutron, they became bitter enemies. Eventually, they decided that Neutron wasn't big enough for the two of them, and they each fought to drive the other either off-world or to extinction. The war was long and brutal, and its battles became the subject of many legends and works of epic poetry. Most famously, the ancient war between the Tongs and the Gel was immortalized in Dha Werda Verda, one of the galaxy's most well-known pieces of ancient literature. This renowned piece of epic poetry consisted of 700 verses, divided into 11 chapters, and was only ever partially translated into Galactic Basic from the ancient language of Neutron Cant. But the translated parts gripped the imagination of the galactic public hundreds of millennia after the end of the war Dha Werda Verda described, and long after the Neutron of old and those who had fought over it were buried under layers of urban zones, the school children of Galactic City were made to memorize the names of ancient Tong generals and the stories of their lives. The Essential Guide to Warfare gives us a full translation of the 9th chapter of Dha Werda Verda, titled The Maker Comes to Unmake, which we'll now recite in full. This chapter describes what the poem's Tong authors considered the climax of the ancient war, and it begins at a dire moment for the Tongs. In battle after battle, the numerous battalions of Gel had prevailed over the skill of the Tongs. Many great Tong chieftains, among them such legends as Olak the Reaver and the Doom of Ulmara, had been slain. The Tongs had retreated to their last stronghold, a high place overlooking Great Gel, where they made a last stand in defiance of their enemies, as Dha Werda Verda details. And so upon his pyre burned the Doom of Ulmara, and the warrior band stood as ragged bandits in zigzag lines of mourning. With the dawn, the flat-faced Gel would come, cackling and howling, oozing mirth and tricks, and find the shade of the Doom departed and the Tongs unprotected. And so, with the dawn would our woe be revealed. Our once bright armaments would become stacked grave goods, trophies for Gel children. Our flesh would become smoke given to uncaring gods, and the sky would forget our names. With death upon him, Rexutu the Unconquerable prepared to be stripped of all by his enemy, but vowed that his honor would be the last to be torn away. And so the Unconquerable gathered his kinsmen and his oath-girdlings alike. They polished their fearsome helms that they might flash even in the weak sun of Neutron. They rewrapped the hilts of their weapons and pounded straight the shafts that they might slake their thirst in Gel Ichor a final time. Assembled, they ascended in taut Tong lines to the high place where the Reaver had stacked his standard before it was cast down into the mire. They gazed out over the gathering places and walking ways of Great Gel, where they scaled peak and cradled valley, the line of lights ordering the night. They unfurled the Tong banner, reversed, a reckless thing snapping in the dark, awaiting Gel eyes. And they performed ceremonies of leave-taking, for now they had died to the world and must be remade among the stars. When the dawn came, the Gel awakened and saw the Tongs upon the high place and were afraid, for the morning light caught the glint of helms and weapons and created phantom warriors made of dazzle and distance. But the cleverest of them were not deceived and saw how few we were. And so they assembled without haste, merry in mockery, and prepared to march. And in the high place, we awaited death. But then came a shaking of the ground, and the sun's light was eclipsed by a bright and terrible fire that exploded from the rock. The patterns of Great Gel shivered and broke. And after this came darkness, as the very air turned to black ash. The Gel fell on their faces in terror, and from the high place we ran in haste to meet them, and we were cloaked in shadow. The Maker had come to unmake, and the Tongs would be his instruments. On the day the Tongs believed they were fated to die, Great Gel was destroyed by a massive volcanic eruption which filled the air with clouds of ash. The battalions of Gel were thrown into disarray, and the Tongs took advantage of the chaos, attacking under the cover of darkness. They routed their enemies, reversing the course of the entire war. The Gel were utterly defeated, enduring grievous losses, while the Tongs, beyond all hope, would live to fight another day. For 2 years after this day, clouds of ash would darken the skies of Neutron, and the planet's distant sun would prove unable to pierce them. In that time, the Tongs struck again and again under the cover of darkness, slaughtering the Gel and driving them to the brink of collapse. The Tongs took their dramatic reversal of fortune as a sign of divine intervention, proof that the gods were on their side, and in memory of their great victory, they took to calling themselves Dha Werda Verda, the warriors of the shadow. Unfortunately for the Tongs, the ash clouds didn't linger in Neutron's skies forever, and as the shadow departed, the war turned back in the Gel's favor. The Tongs were eventually defeated and exiled from Neutron, forced to flee in great spaceships across the stars, seeking a new home. The Gel took Neutron for their own, and under their sole rule, the planet was transformed. As Gel society entered a new age of peace and prosperity, the Gel multiplied rapidly. Their cities expanded and merged until they became one great city, a shell around the entire planet. 100,000 years after the destruction of Great Gel, this city stretched from pole to pole, burying Neutron's original surface under a layer of durasteel and ferrocrete. And 10,000 years after that, with the help of the Gree, the city began to expand vertically, building upon itself, becoming the multi-leveled Ecumenopolis that would later be known as Galactic City. As Neutron was completely consumed by this glittering metropolis, it became known by a new name, which reflected its appearance from orbit, Coruscant. And as their homeworld was transformed, so too were the Gel, who, by the time they struck out into the stars, had also become known by a new name, humanity. From Coruscant, these humans, the heirs of the ancient Gel, spread out across the galaxy, settling countless worlds and building galaxy-spanning civilizations, with Coruscant at the heart of it all. The Gel not only won their descendants sole control of their homeworld, but also rule over the entire galaxy. Ironically enough though, no Gel accounts of their ancient war survived to the modern age. Indeed, as the Gel and their heirs converted Neutron into Coruscant, they destroyed nearly all traces of their own history, burying it all under kilometers of skyscraper blocks. Humanity forgot its own origins to such an extreme that, in the Imperial era, it was uncertain whether or not humanity had actually evolved on Coruscant or not, and the connection between the Gel and modern humans was only considered a theory, one that couldn't be substantiated due to the inaccessibility of Coruscant's true surface. The memory of Gel survived only in the chronicles of the Tongs, preserved only in the poetry of their enemies, for the most part. There was one archaeological site on Coruscant that was believed to be linked to the Gel. It lay close to the planet's south pole, buried hundreds of meters under the Hasamadi Warehouse District, which was built atop an enormous polar glacier. This glacier was riddled with tunnels that plunged deep into the ice, winding ever downwards until they came to a series of caves known as the Ice Crypts. These were 13 chambers, each containing a mummified corpse entombed with numerous grave goods, among them ancient weapons, armor, and other battle trophies. Archaeologists believe that these crypts were the final resting place of the 13 chieftains of Gel who had fled to the frozen wastelands of Neutron's far south after the destruction of Great Gel. This was impossible to confirm, but if it were true, then the ice crypts were the last remnant of the ancient ancestors of humanity, all that remained of a civilization whose heirs ruled the stars. Over the course of millennia, Coruscant was built up into the greatest ecumenopolis in the galaxy. Galactic City built upon itself, layer by layer, and it became the heart of the most powerful civilization in the galaxy, the Galactic Republic. When the Republic was founded in 25,053 BBY, before the Battle of Yavin, Coruscant became its capital, and for 25 millennia, it thrived as the Republic expanded across the galaxy. As the Republic grew and ever greater amounts of wealth and resources flowed toward its core, Galactic City grew at an increasingly rapid pace. Its oldest levels were buried and became inaccessible, and the uppermost levels climbed ever higher into the skies. By the final centuries of the Republic, Galactic City had 5,127 levels, the highest of which were located far above Coruscant's original surface. Even the highest of the planet's mountain peaks were all but completely buried under layers of city, and the last remnants of Coruscant's natural surface disappeared. Coruscant, as it existed in the final century of Republic history, was a completely artificial planet. This didn't just apply to the planet's urban surface either. Everything from its climate to its atmosphere was artificially maintained and meticulously managed. Without this environmental management, Coruscant would have been uninhabitable. All of it was maintained by unfathomably complex life support infrastructure, which is the topic of our next story, all the artificial systems that made Coruscant livable. Galactic City was kilometers tall, and its 5,000 odd levels stretched from the barren floors of Coruscant's dried up oceans up into the clouds, above the planet's tallest mountain peaks. The levels were numbered, with level 1 being the lowest and level 5,127 being the highest. Based on the fact that a few mountain peaks poked up into the highest levels, it didn't seem like each level was a whole city in its own right. Rather, it's possible that each level was only a few stories tall. Not all levels were fully inhabited or accessible either. As Galactic City was built upon itself, parts of the lower levels were filled in to provide stable foundations for buildings above. The lowest 1,000 or so levels of Galactic City were completely inaccessible, inhabited by only semi-sentient mutant Chthons and other horrible creatures. The deepest and most ancient of these levels were completely filled in with millennia's worth of trash, and the levels directly above them were choked with toxic gases. Above these outright inaccessible levels were the abandoned, barely habitable levels of the Undercity, the domain of mutants and outcasts, choked with detritus and gnawed corpses. Above these darkest depths was the Coruscant underworld, the lowest inhabited part of Galactic City. The underworld began more than a kilometer below Coruscant's surface and it was so deep in Galactic City that it never saw sunlight. This was the region at the bottom of the vast urban canyons and cavernous underworld portals that cut through the higher levels of the city. A place of crime and poverty, where government and safety were virtually non-existent, and gangsters ruled without challenge. The lowest levels of the underworld, such as the infamous level 1313, were among the most dangerous places in the galaxy. A twilight realm where violent murders were an everyday occurrence and where daily life was a struggle. The people living down there eked out a meager existence in the underworld's spidering alleys, which stretched through the narrow gaps between the foundations of higher levels and the great machines needed to maintain life in Galactic City. The buildings down here were a mix of ancient ruins and more modern but run-down constructs, uniformly filthy and dilapidated. Above the underworld was the middle layer of Galactic City, which was unnamed and is rarely touched on in Star Wars media. This region extended up to about level 5000 and was likely a middle-income district, more structured than the underworld, but less glamorous than the highest reaches of the city. These were the uppermost levels, the ones above level 5000, located at the planet's surface, such as it is. Here, countless skyscrapers stab up into the sky, which is filled with a congested network of sky lanes. Numerous spaceports, landing platforms, and commercial facilities of all kinds can be found up here, as well as government facilities and the residencies of Coruscant's wealthiest denizens. Many of Coruscant's most well-known buildings, among them the Senate Building, Jedi Temple, Galactic Courts of Justice, and the residential skyscraper 500 Republica, were located up here. All of Coruscant's 5,127 levels were subdivided, broken up into quadrants, zones, megablocks, blocks, and subblocks. The quadrants, also known as districts, represented huge swaths of each level, which were subdivided into zones based on function, while the various levels of blocks designated specific neighborhoods. Many of these subdivisions had local nicknames. The residential district, Quadrant H46 for instance, was known as Sucktown after the wealthy family that owned most of it. Much of Galactic City was taken up by residential sectors, but not all of it. You also had industrial sectors, like the Works, commercial districts, such as Cocoa Town, and a great deal of warehouse districts. Perhaps the most well-known sectors of Galactic City were the Senate District and the Temple Precinct, home to the Senate Building and the Jedi Temple respectively. Both of these districts were located close to Coruscant's equator, which was the most densely populated part of the planet, while less populated and unpopulated industrial regions tended to be located closer to the poles. The poles themselves featured one of the largest and most vital parts of Coruscant's planet-wide life support systems, the hubs of Galactic City's water distribution system. Long ago, Coruscant's surface had been mostly dominated by oceans, but these oceans were drained into vast subterranean caverns during the construction of Galactic City. Modern Coruscant did actually have some bodies of water, all of them artificial. The largest of these reservoirs was the Great Western Sea, a moderately large artificial sea on the upper levels of Coruscant's western hemisphere, which was dotted with floating artificial islands. But none of these bodies of water were capable of fulfilling the needs of Coruscant's vast population. Rather, the Coruscanti instead got their drinking water from the planet's poles. Coruscant's ancient polar ice caps had long ago been buried under levels of city blocks, but they still existed nonetheless, and they were carefully maintained by the planet's weather control systems. Atop each ice cap was a massive water distribution hub, which melted down some of the ice into liquid water and ferried it across the city through enormous pipelines. This water distribution system stretched across the city, and it was complemented by water recycling systems to prevent waste and an unnecessary strain on the ice caps' production capacity. These recycling systems were only part of a massive artificial ecosystem that constantly stabilized Coruscant's biosphere, allowing life to continue in Galactic City. An especially important part of this life support network was a grid of atmospheric dampeners spread throughout the planet's upper atmosphere. These machines constantly worked to keep Coruscant's atmosphere breathable and stable despite the enormous amount of carbon dioxide and other waste gases produced by Galactic City's inhabitants and local industry. Coruscant's atmospheric dampeners broke down these gases, ensuring that Coruscant's atmosphere remained a healthy nitrogen-oxygen mix and preventing climate change caused by a buildup of greenhouse gases. Without this network of atmospheric dampeners, Coruscant would have become uninhabitable long ago. Thus, even Coruscant's atmosphere was artificial and carefully maintained. Coruscant's weather was largely artificial too. Coruscant had weather control systems, like most heavily industrialized planets did, most notably the Coruscant weather net. Most of the time, Coruscant seems to have had clear or partly cloudy skies, with precipitation concentrated at the poles to maintain Galactic City's water supply. However, there were a few known instances of other parts of Coruscant experiencing rain and even thunderstorms, as happened shortly after the Battle of Coruscant in 19 BBY. Due to the sheer height of Galactic City, Coruscant's climate actually had layers, which were created by the patterns wind circulated in through the planet's urban canyons. This created at least 3 layers of convection, and clouds could form in all 3 of them. As a result, the underworld could experience severe thunderstorms while the districts above enjoyed clear, sunny skies. Another key part of Coruscant's climate regulation systems were its orbital mirrors. As we mentioned earlier, Coruscant was originally a cold planet as a consequence of being fairly far from its sun, but its climate was made much warmer by a grid of huge mirrors built in orbit, which reflected additional sunlight to warm up Coruscant's surface. These mirrors, officially named Orbital Solar Energy Transfer Satellites, were only a few of the vast assortment of satellites that orbited the galactic capital. Apart from Coruscant's 4 moons, Coruscant was orbited by numerous skyhooks, habitation spheres, battle platforms, and other space stations, many of which had massive populations of their own. Coruscant was also orbited by a great deal of garbage. Waste disposal was one of Galactic City's greatest infrastructural challenges. Every hour, Coruscant produced trillions of tons of waste, and while the Coruscanti got pretty creative at finding ways to recycle just about everything, some things just had to be thrown out. Such items were originally just dumped into the lowest levels, but this was soon determined to be a bad idea, and a better system was devised. A network of 5,000 garbage pits was built across the galaxy, where garbage was collected, packed into canisters, and fired into low orbit by massive garbage launchers. There, it was picked up by garbage haulers, which towed the garbage canisters to one of several places. Some garbage was broken down by garbage worms, which extracted usable materials and converted the rest into waste gases, which could more easily be disposed of. Most was instead dumped on the uninhabited moons of Coruscant system's gas giants. The most dangerous garbage was instead fired directly into Coruscant Prime, the system's star. All of these systems kept Galactic City habitable, while other aspects of the city's infrastructure ensured that Coruscant was worth living on. Coruscant was home to numerous power plants, the largest and most important of which were buried deep in the planet. There were also power distribution centers built throughout the city, with those providing power to the uppermost levels located on level 5000. Other networks provided the city with access to the HoloNet and other modern amenities. All of these things came together to enable Coruscant to function as the heart of the Republic and indeed the heart of the galaxy. But enough about infrastructure for now. Let's move on to another story. Our next story took place 15,500 years before the Battle of Yavin, and unless you've seen our series on the history of the Republic, you probably haven't heard of it before. This story is about a brief conflict known as the Duinuogwuin Contention, a brief conflict that would have seen Galactic City laid waste were it not for the intervention of one of the Republic's most revered Supreme Chancellors. Late in the Endecta era, Republic scouts in the Outer Rim made contact with a new sentient species near Mokana, the Duinuogwuin, also known as Star Dragons, which is what we'll be calling them going forward. These sentients were reptilian in nature, but highly unusual. Their segmented serpentine bodies could grow over to 100 meters in length, and they had 2 wings and dozens of pairs of legs. Their scales were extremely durable, as was the skin beneath, and they also had potent regenerative capabilities, allowing them to recover from all but the most grievous of wounds. They could survive in the vacuum of space, live for thousands of years, and with the help of their wings and organs that created a natural repulsor lift effect, they could fly from a planet's surface into space unassisted. Star dragons could travel through hyperspace, and they were even capable of breathing atomic fire. They were some of the most unusual sentient beings in the galaxy, and understandably enough, the Republic scouts that first encountered them were absolutely terrified. First contact between the Republic scouts and the Star Dragons went very poorly. What exactly happened isn't known, but whatever the Republic scouts did provoked the Star Dragons to war. The scouts fled all the way back to Coruscant, and hundreds of Star Dragons pursued through hyperspace. The scouts had scarcely made it home when the Duinuogwuin descended upon Galactic City, destroying skyscrapers with blasts of atomic fire, and generally sowing chaos and terror. The Republic had inadvertently made a powerful enemy and then led them back to its capital. Fortunately for everyone in Galactic City, however, the Star Dragons' rampage was short-lived. After learning of the misunderstanding that had started the conflict, Supreme Chancellor Felorian personally set out to negotiate with the Star Dragons. He made contact with one of the attacking Duinuogwuin, a philosopher named Bors-Mato, and together the two brought an end to the conflict. A ceasefire was declared, and against all odds, the Duinuogwuin Contention ended with the Republic establishing peaceful relations with the Star Dragons. The attackers retreated, the damage to Galactic City was repaired, and the Star Dragons became known more for their wisdom rather than for their terrifying capabilities. Felorian and Bors-Mato remained friends after the end of the contention, and in later years, the two co-founded the University of Coruscant. This university became one of the galaxy's most prestigious educational institutions, and it honored the negotiations that ended the Duinuogwuin Contention by building statues of its two founders, which stood proudly on the university's grounds for the next 15,000 years, a testament to one of the Republic's founding principles, that negotiation and diplomacy are always preferable to the horrors of war. With that said, not all of the Republic's wars ended in negotiation, and not all attacks on Coruscant were ended with such ease. Though the Republic Navy always did its best to keep enemy forces away from the galactic capital, Coruscant came under attack numerous times in the galaxy's long history, and several of these battles inflicted serious damage on Galactic City. 31 battles on Coruscant, some great and some small, are recorded in Star Wars Legends, and for our next story, we're going to talk about some of the biggest. The first major attack on Coruscant during the Age of the Republic took place in the Republic's first serious war, the Taiwanese War, fought in 24,000 BBY. At the start of this war, the Republic had yet to adopt a standing military, which left it highly vulnerable when Taiwanese forces poured down the Polemian trade route and attacked the core worlds. The Republic was unable to mobilize an army in time to prevent a fleet of Taion jacks from attacking Coruscant itself, shelling Galactic City with pressure bombs and laying waste to its upper levels. The Taiwanese fleet was driven off shortly thereafter by the New Republic Navy, but Taiwanese raiders would return a few times over the course of the next 100 years, carrying out subsequent pressure bomb attacks on Coruscant. These attacks devastated Galactic City's infrastructure and civilian population, as pressure bombs were powerful weapons that unleashed tremendous concussive forces upon a large area, leveling entire city blocks in the process. It's unknown how many millions of people were killed in the pressure bomb attacks on Coruscant, but the death toll would have been staggeringly high. Fortunately for the Coruscanti, the nightmare wouldn't last. After the newly assembled Republic Navy established Anaxis as its stronghold on the Polemian, they were able to repulse all subsequent Taiwanese attacks on the core worlds, and eventually, Republic forces pushed back down the Polemian and attacked the Taion cluster itself. In retaliation for the damage done to Galactic City, the Navy pressure-bombed the Taiwanese capital world, Decevero, until the whole planet lay in ruins, ignoring the Decevera's unconditional surrender until they had made an example of the planet. Following the Taiwanese War, Coruscant enjoyed many thousands of years of peace. Thanks to the Republic garrison at Anaxis, which shielded Coruscant from assaults from the Rim, enemy forces weren't able to break through to attack the galactic capital for another 19,000 years, with the exception of Duinuogwuin's surprise attack. Even as Coruscant fought civil wars with Alsaken, its planetary neighbor, and experienced political upheaval during the rise and fall of the Pius Dei cult, it would not come under attack from enemy forces until the beginning of the Sith Wars. The Sith were the greatest enemy the Republic ever faced, and they were able to attack Coruscant several times over the course of the Sith Wars. The first such attack came during the Great Hyperspace War of 5000 BBY, in which the combined forces of the Sith Empire were able to jump straight from Korriban into the deep core along the Daragon Trail. They emerged from hyperspace without warning in the Koros system, which the Sith immediately besieged, while the rest of the fleet charged down the Koros trunk line to attack Coruscant. In doing so, the Sith bypassed Anaxis and the rest of the Republic's military strongholds, essentially attacking Coruscant from behind and catching it entirely off guard. The Senate had only just heard the news of the Sith fleet attacking Koros Major when an enormous fleet of Sith warships appeared in Coruscant's skies and bombarded Galactic City with drop pods, which disgorged hordes of Massassi warriors and Sith-spawned beasts under the command of the Sith Lord Shah Khan. This attack took place before the construction of the Coruscant Jedi Temple, so the defense of Galactic City fell to the Republic military, which was assisted by the handful of Jedi Knights that happened to be on Coruscant at the time. Coruscant's defenders were caught unprepared, and they scrambled to respond to the Sith assault. They struggled due to the ferocity of the attacking Sith and the sheer size of their forces, which consisted of tens of thousands of ships and millions of Massassi. The Sith swarmed over Galactic City, driving the Jedi back to the steps of the Senate Hall itself. But just when all seemed lost, a large portion of the attacking Sith force vanished. As it turned out, most of the Armada had consisted of illusions conjured up by Naga Sadow, the Dark Lord of the Sith. Republic forces had found his meditation sphere and broken his concentration, and as they did, the phantom ships and warriors vanished. The true Sith attack force was much smaller than the Republic had been led to believe, and once this became apparent, the Sith were routed and driven from Coruscant. Ultimately, Coruscant got lucky in the Great Hyperspace War. The Sith attack was thwarted, and Galactic City didn't suffer all that much damage. Republic forces soon rallied at Anaxis and drove the remainder of the Sith Armada out of Republic space, following which they would launch a counter-invasion of the Sith Empire. The Sith Empire was destroyed, but remnants of it survived, and 1,000 years later, a new war with the Sith would begin. This conflict, the Great Sith War, would see Coruscant attacked once again, but as in the Great Hyperspace War, Coruscant ultimately got off easy. Once more, the Sith attacked along the Koros trunk line, as the Koros system had come under the control of the Sith-aligned Krath cult and was a major staging ground for their fleet. This time round, the Republic was more prepared for such an attack. It had stationed a fleet at Phorost, a major shipyard world along the trunk line, to guard against a Krath attack on the core worlds. But with the help of Sith sorcery and the Mandalorian Crusaders, the Sith were able to crush the Republic forces at Phorost and then move on to attack Coruscant. In the lead up to the battle, the Sith had drawn a large part of Coruscant's defense fleet away from Chemplex 11, leaving the galactic capital vulnerable when their fleet attacked. As a result, Sith forces were able to quickly breach Coruscant's defensive blockade and land ground forces in Galactic City. Krath Chaos Fighters and Mandalorians riding Basilisk war droids laid waste to the upper levels of the city to keep the Jedi bogged down protecting innocents, while the Sith's ground troops set out to capture several key targets, including a major weapons depot and the Republic Command Center. The Sith Lord in charge of the assault, Ulic Qel-Droma, planned to use the Command Center to order every ship in the Republic Navy to jump to the same coordinates at once, destroying them all in the process and crippling the Republic military. But his plan was cut short when the leader of the Krath, Alima Keto, unexpectedly ordered all Sith forces to retreat. Despite the fact that the Sith had the advantage and were routing Coruscant's defenders, they acknowledged Alima's orders and retreated to their landers, abandoning the assault on Coruscant and returning to Krath space. Ulic Qel-Droma was left behind, allowing the Jedi to capture him, as Alima, who wanted to usurp control of the Sith Armada, had planned. Qel-Droma ultimately escaped Republic custody and repaid Alima for her treachery, but she had nonetheless prevented the Sith from capturing Coruscant. Thanks to the treachery of the Sith, the damage inflicted on Galactic City wasn't nearly as severe as it might otherwise have been, and the Republic was able to retain control of its capital. Twice in a row, Coruscant staved off a Sith attack with only moderate damage to the upper levels of Galactic City, but its luck was not to last. During the Great Galactic War, several centuries after the Great Sith War, the true Sith Empire carried out its own attack on the galactic capital, and this time, Coruscant was devastated. 28 years into the Great Galactic War, the true Sith had the Republic on the back foot, having conquered large portions of Republic space with their vast armada. Despite this, they unexpectedly offered to negotiate an end to the war with the Republic, proposing a conference on Alderaan to decide the terms of a peace treaty. The Senate was wary of the Sith's intentions, but it accepted the offer to negotiate, eager for any reprieve from the long and costly war. They expected that the Sith would attempt some sort of treachery, but they thought it would take place on Alderaan, where the peace conference was due to be held. They never imagined the conference would be used as a distraction from an attack on Coruscant itself. As the peace conference on Alderaan began, the Mandalorian mercenary Shae Vizsla deactivated Coruscant's defense grid, allowing a team of Sith warriors led by Darth Malgus to attack the Jedi Temple. While the Jedi were distracted by this attack, a massive fleet led by Darth Angral arrived in the Coruscant system and descended into the galactic capital's lower atmosphere, where it began to bombard Galactic City. Huge armies of ground troops were deployed to sack the planet, and while Republic forces and the remaining Jedi did their best to defend the galactic capital, they were ultimately overwhelmed. In the end, the Jedi Temple was utterly destroyed. Half of the Council and numerous other Jedi were killed, the Supreme Chancellor was murdered, and Galactic City was utterly devastated, enduring the most severe damage that had ever been inflicted upon it. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed. For the next 2 days, the Sith occupied Coruscant, establishing a blockade above the planet and cutting off all communications to and from the Coruscant system. In that time, they hunted down and assassinated surviving Jedi and senators, imposed a brutal state of martial law on the planet, and looted Galactic City, inflicting even further damage on the planet. Following the sacking of Coruscant, the Republic delegates on Alderaan were forced into signing the Treaty of Coruscant, which ended the Great Galactic War. With the signing of the treaty, the Sith abandoned Coruscant and let the Republic reclaim its capital, but this came at the cost of massive territorial concessions, which put the Sith in control of half the known galaxy. Coruscant was utterly devastated, and the reconstruction of Galactic City took an enormous amount of time and resources, as well as help from the Gree. Some of the lower levels never truly recovered from the sacking of Coruscant, and it would be a long time before even a semblance of Republic law returned to much of the planet, much of which came under the rule of a new criminal cartel known as the Black Sun. Coruscant wouldn't suffer another attack on the scale of the sacking of Coruscant for millennia to come. The Sith attacked the galactic capital one last time during the New Sith Wars, but this attack was brief, opportunistic, and quickly fell apart due to Sith infighting, and as a result, Galactic City once more got off easy. It wouldn't be attacked again for the next 1,000 years, an era of peace that only ended during the Clone Wars. That brings us to the most famous battle of Coruscant, the last to take place during the Age of the Republic. 3 years into the Clone Wars, during the 6th month of the Outer Rim sieges, a massive separatist armada jumped into orbit above the galactic capital. This enormous fleet was thousands of capital ships strong and represented a full 1/6 of the CIS Navy's surviving assets, mostly drawn from the Yagdul Theater. These thousands of capital ships were carrying droid armies numbering in the hundreds of millions, and the whole force was led by General Grievous himself. It attacked without warning, and it was met by an entirely unprepared defense fleet. Much of the Coruscant home fleet had been reassigned to the Outer Rim sieges, and Grievous was able to catch what remained of the fleet with its shields down. The Separatist Armada jumped in right on top of the home fleet, destroying a large part of it in a matter of minutes, leaving only around 1,000 Republic vessels operational. Once the home fleet recovered from the initial surprise attack, the naval battle to end all naval battles began. After jamming all communications to and from Coruscant and seeding the outer limits of the system with hyperspace mines, Grievous ordered his ships to spread out and begin attacking targets of opportunity, while his ground armies deployed and did the same on the surface. Separatist warships began firing on communication satellites, orbital mirrors, and random surface locations, while on the planet below, millions of Ultra droids poured through the clouds, deliberately flying into buildings, commuter rail lines, and other civilian targets. The battle lasted for a week, and there was no rhyme or reason to it. With communications jammed, the Republic fleet was scattered as well, and before long, ships on both sides began shooting at whatever was closest. The chaos was mirrored on the ground. For days, the attack seemed to be totally disorganized, a desperate last act of revenge against the Republic. But the Jedi realized, much too late, that the whole thing was yet another diversion. Grievous used the chaos as cover to kidnap Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, spiriting him away to his flagship, the Invisible Hand. But even as it seemed that the Separatists were about to win the war with their daring attack, the tide of the battle began to turn. Republic forces were able to destroy the Confederacy's communications jammer, allowing Republic High Command to recall the rest of the home fleet. Republic Navy fleet groups rushed back to the capital, forcing Grievous's fleet into the upper atmosphere and cornering it, preventing the Separatists from escaping with the captive Chancellor. Republic forces were able to forestall the Armada's retreat just long enough for Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi to board the Invisible Hand, rescue the Supreme Chancellor, and kill Count Dooku himself. Grievous abandoned the ship and led the remainder of his fleet in a retreat back through the deep core, leaving the Republic victorious. The Battle of Coruscant was a death knell for the CIS, which ceased to exist just days after the battle, bringing an end to the Clone Wars. The Republic was victorious, but the cost to Coruscant was severe. During the battle, Grievous had ordered his forces to cause as much damage to Coruscant's infrastructure as possible. His fleet, armies, and air wing had destroyed numerous buildings, taken out commuter trains and orbital mirrors, and left large parts of Galactic City in ruins. But the worst of the damage was unintentional, if not unforeseen. Most of the space battle took place within Coruscant's gravity well, which meant that debris and crippled capital ships rained down on Galactic City all throughout the battle. The debris was bad enough. It fell like a hail of meteors upon Coruscant, inflicting further damage to buildings and public spaces. But there were also hundreds of capital ships, each hundreds of meters long, that were crippled but not destroyed outright, and these slammed into Coruscant like comets, obliterating entire city blocks when they struck the surface. The falls of these doomed ships dotted Galactic City with vast burning craters, each killing thousands at the minimum. Coruscant continued to burn for days after the end of the battle, as described in the Revenge of the Sith novelization. Leaning on the night-chilled rail, Anakin stared out upon the endless nightscape of Coruscant. It was still burning. Coruscant at night had always been an endless galaxy of light, shining from trillions of windows and billions of buildings that reached kilometers into the sky, with navigation lights and advertising and the infinite streams of speeders' running lights coursing through the rivers of traffic lanes overhead. But tonight, local power outages had swallowed ragged swaths of the city into a vast nebulae of darkness, broken only by the malignant red dwarf glares of innumerable fires. Anakin didn't know how long he stood there, staring. The city looked like he felt. damaged, broken in battle, stained with darkness. The Battle of Coruscant would not be the last battle to take place on the galactic capital, but since it was the last during the Age of the Republic, we'll end our story there. Don't worry though, we'll be talking about some of the post-Republic battles later on. As should be apparent by now, the Jedi and Sith fought over Coruscant repeatedly, and over the millennia, both orders established long-term presences on the galactic capital. The Jedi famously had their temple on Coruscant in the Republic's final millennia, though for most of the Jedi Order's history, this temple didn't exist. In fact, the Jedi avoided establishing a permanent presence on Coruscant for 20,000 years for fear of becoming entwined with the politics of the capital. But after the Great Hyperspace War, the Senate gifted the Order a tract of land on Coruscant in gratitude for their role in stopping the Sith. And after the destruction of the Jedi homeworld of Ossus in the Great Sith War, this tract became the site of the Jedi Temple. Over the course of the next 4,000 years, the temple steadily grew into an enormous ziggurat crowned with 5 towers, a towering monument to the Order. As the years went on, the formerly diffuse Order became more centralized, and as it did, the temple on Coruscant became increasingly significant. By the Republic's final centuries, it was the home of most of the galaxy's Jedi, the nerve center of the entire Jedi Order. But the Jedi weren't the only Force-based Order with a presence on Coruscant. The Sith had strongholds of their own on the planet. In canon, the Jedi Temple itself was built atop an ancient Sith shrine established during the Great Hyperspace War, though this isn't the case in Legends. More significantly, Darth Sidious, the final Dark Lord of the Sith, lived on Coruscant for decades, and in this time, he covertly built a few little readouts for himself. Sidious regularly met with his apprentices and other agents in the abandoned Limerge building, a skyscraper in the rundown, largely derelict industrial district known as the Works. Once the headquarters of Limerge Power's Coruscant branch, which once owned numerous industrial plants and weapons manufacturing facilities in the surrounding block, the skyscraper had been abandoned over a century before the Clone Wars. Limerge Power, which Darth Plagueis and Darth Sidious secretly controlled and used as a shell company, continued to own the building, preventing it from being demolished or repossessed. But it was left empty, as was most of the district in which it was located. This made it ideal for the Sith's purposes, and Darth Sidious used it as his headquarters for decades. Sidious trained and regularly met with Darth Maul and later Darth Tyrannus at the Limerge building, and Tyrannus also occasionally met with his dark acolytes there during the Clone Wars. During the final weeks of the Clone Wars, the Jedi Order carried out a search of the Limerge building during their hunt for Darth Sidious. A team led by Mace Windu, the Arc Commander Valiant, and Republic Intelligence Captain Dine was able to find a set of Sidious's footprints left in the layer of dust that coated the building's floors, which led them to a network of tunnels that stretched far under the Senate district. They followed these tunnels to one of the sub-basements of 500 Republica, a prestigious apartment building where many wealthy and powerful figures lived, including a certain Supreme Chancellor. Mace Windu and several of the clones were then drawn off as the Battle of Coruscant began, leaving only Dine, Valiant, and a few troopers to continue the search. They were ultimately able to discover a hidden command center under 500 Republica that Sidious made use of, though they were killed by a pair of Geonosian guards before they could report this discovery. These weren't Sidious's only hideouts on Coruscant either. The Dark Lord made use of the office of the Supreme Chancellor for his Sith dealings as well. He often issued orders to his minions from his private office in the complex, and the complex as a whole was actually full of Sith artifacts, which Sidious hid in plain sight. Among these were a pair of large black urns containing the ashes of Darth Bane and Darth Plagueis, a Sith chalice containing rare Korribanian incense recovered from a ruined temple on Yavin 4, and a bas-relief depicting a scene from the Great Hyperspace War, which subtly glorified the Sith participants. Sidious's main readout on Coruscant, however, was actually the Chancellor Palpatine's Surgical Reconstruction Center, known as the Chanpal-Su Recon Center for short. This mighty skyscraper was mostly an actual hospital, which was by design. Sidious believed that even if the Jedi discovered his stronghold in the building, they would still be hesitant to attack a hospital. Sidious's fortress was concealed in the highest tier of the building, above its emergency landing pads. This part of the building was built with heavy neuranium armor and incorporated hidden air defense turrets, large false windows that made it seem like the building had nothing to hide, and a powerful communications array that allowed Sidious to get into contact with his minions from all across the galaxy. The floors visible through the building's bay windows were given over to medical droid storage and a few genuine operating theaters, one of which was used for Darth Vader's cybernetic reconstruction. But below these levels, disguised as additional droid storage, was Darth Sidious's private sanctum, a nexus of dark side power. This sanctum contained a meditation chamber used by Sidious, communications equipment, and computer banks that housed the Sith's massive electronic archives. It was also home to an enormous trove of Sith artifacts. Among these were countless Sith holocrons, scrolls, and weapons, enormous force-attuned crystals imbued with the dark side, a repository of synthetic lightsaber crystals, a ritual altar from Ziost, and the sacred Great Crystal of Antonay. This wellspring of dark side power was Darth Sidious's true lair, and it was also used by Darth Vader following his cybernetic reconstruction. During the Dark Times, however, Sidious established a new, far grander lair for himself. This was the Imperial Palace, formerly the Republic's presidential palace, which was expanded until it became the tallest structure on Coruscant. In fact, it was estimated by some to be the largest building in the entire galaxy. Once it was complete, Sidious moved all the artifacts from his other hideouts into it, and throughout his reign, the new palace became the dark heart of the galactic capital. Our next story is one of the lesser Republic-era battles on Coruscant, the Great Droid Revolution of 4015 BBY. This short-lived uprising was started by the assassin droid HK-01, a new and highly sophisticated droid with unprecedented levels of intelligence and independence. These attributes were necessary to make the droid an effective assassin, but as the galaxy soon learned, they also gave the droid a great deal of freedom, enough that it could choose to rebel against its masters. But HK-01 wasn't satisfied with achieving freedom for itself. Once it had broken free of its master's control, it set about building an army, reprogramming droids all over Coruscant and commanding them to start an uprising. Vast numbers of droids rallied to the rogue assassin's cause, and chaos broke out across the galactic capital. At HK-01's behest, the rogue droid army fought to exterminate all organic life, first on Coruscant and then all across the galaxy. Among the droids that participated in the uprising was the Republic's cadre of Juggernaut war droids. These fearsome battle droids had been built to serve alongside the Republic's famed rocket jumper units in battles and peacekeeping actions across the Outer Rim, joining the rocket jumpers in performing jetpack-assisted orbital drops onto surface targets. The Juggernauts and rocket jumpers had served together for centuries, but in the Great Droid Revolution, they battled each other. The relentless Juggernauts seized several armories and weapons depots across Coruscant before engaging in a highly publicized aerial battles with the rocket jumpers over Monument Plaza. The war droids were victorious, much to the horror of the Republic's citizenry. The Great Droid Revolution only came to an end when the Jedi Order got involved. A team of Jedi, led by the renowned Master Arca Jeth, came to Coruscant to put down the uprising, and in the end, not even the fearsome Juggernaut war droids were a match for the power of the Force. The droid army was crushed, and HK-01 was captured and destroyed, bringing an end to the Great Droid Revolution. The Republic, and Coruscant in particular, was left reeling from the uprising for years to come. The Great Droid Revolution was brief, but its impact was great, and not just in the damage it inflicted on Coruscant. Following the uprising, droid manufacturers began dramatically scaling back the intelligence of their products, and the Republic Army was purged of its battle droid units. Battle droids returned to the Republic Army a few decades later during the Mandalorian Wars, but it would be centuries before most droid manufacturers were willing to make droids as intelligent as those seen before the revolution. The Great Droid Revolution also saw a rise in the development of ion weapons, which became commonplace in the decades that followed. Even when Coruscant was sheltered from the direct effects of conflicts, it often felt the aftershocks, both in terms of economic and political impacts, as well as in influxes of refugees. War displaces people wherever it occurs, and in the Star Wars universe, a disproportionate number of those displaced by war ended up on Coruscant, forming innumerable diaspora populations in Galactic City. A particularly prominent example of this phenomenon happened during the Separatist Crisis, shortly before the outbreak of the Clone Wars, as the secessions of thousands of systems displaced vast numbers of people. Some were loyalists, driven from their homeworlds by rising separatist sentiments. Some did business in the Republic and couldn't afford to leave it, and others were displaced by the regional turmoil the waves of secession caused. In the 2 years leading up to the Clone Wars, an endless flood of these beings poured into Galactic City from the immigration centers at Eastport. As if being displaced from their homeworlds wasn't bad enough, many refugees were in for further misfortune when they reached Coruscant. The overcrowding of Eastport and Coruscant's other spaceports led to disease outbreaks, including an epidemic of brainworm rot A, and those refugees that made it through the spaceport often had nowhere to go. A lucky few were able to settle in the tolerable parts of Galactic City, but many wound up in the underworld, and some unfortunate refugee communities had to carve out their own settlements. One of these latter groups had to resort to building a shanty town in the barrel of one of Coruscant's garbage launchers, which led to tragedy when their settlement caused a catastrophic misfire, devastating a whole district of northern Galactic City. To quote a Holonet news report on the incident, "The Desrini district of northern Coruscant is still closely following a catastrophic garbage launcher misfire that has killed at least 48 and has littered the entire district with dangerous industrial waste." At 0801 this morning, Waste Canister Delivery Port 84D21 launched its regularly scheduled payload of industrial refuse sealed in a shielded container. The projectile came into contact with a sizable obstruction, causing it to shred apart within the launcher barrel. The entire cannon assembly collapsed, taking out the 4 surrounding city blocks. Emergency rescue crews arrived on the scene in less than half an hour and have been working since then to clear the rubble. At least 48 bodies have been recovered and over 200 injuries have been reported. The rescue crews have identified the barrel obstruction as a shantytown of refugees living within the launch chamber. From the looks of it, there were at least 4 families of squatters living between the 4th and 5th accelerator gates. They had tapped into the cannon's energy grid, which disabled its obstruction sensors, said Captain Gelamure of Desrini Rescue Ops. The destroyed canister contained 115 metric tons of concentrated industrial waste, including hyperboride runoff, trichorinium, hexafluorine, and destabilized russium. The canister's explosion has spread this waste over the disaster site, and emergency workers are dressed in full tox gear to carry out rescue efforts. The Coruscant WeatherNet has cancelled prevailing winds in the area, but natural air currents caused by undercity convection is spreading a dangerous cloud of industrial toxins. All non-pressurized structures in the surrounding 10-kilometer radius have been evacuated. But this was only the start of the misfortune that Coruscant's refugee population would face. As the flood of refugees only increased and Coruscant experienced a wave of bombings carried out by separatist-aligned terrorists, hawkish voices calling for stronger restrictions for refugees inbound to Coruscant prevailed. Galactic City began taking on fewer refugees, and those who had already arrived found themselves being policed increasingly heavily. This escalated further during the Clone Wars, which saw a rise in xenophobic sentiments among loyalists, targeted primarily at members of species whose homeworlds were part of the CIS. Nemoidians, Skakoans, Gossams, Aqualish, and others were treated with suspicion, profiled by Coruscant's security officers, and subjected to increased surveillance. This, combined with pressure from the speciest and rabidly loyalist group, Compor, culminated in the Coruscant Ministry of Ingress deciding to deport a whole slew of so-called separatist species from Coruscant entirely, rendering them refugees once more. This measure called for the deportation of billions, and, cruelly enough, most of the people it targeted were fervent loyalists, having fled to Coruscant out of opposition to the separatist movement. This edict was never fully enforceable due to how many members of these species lived on Coruscant, but those who managed to escape deportation were subject to constant harassment from Compor and from the Coruscant Guard, which, following the passage of sweeping new security acts in 21 BBY, was given the power to impose strict curfews on districts of Galactic City, carry out warrantless searches and seizures, and stop and demand identification from random passerbys on the street. The Guard used these new powers to make life hell for many of Coruscant's alien residents. Parts of Galactic City were virtually under martial law by the end of the war, with protests against this state of affairs brutally crushed by the Coruscant Guard. All told, refugees, as well as non-humans in general, didn't have a good time on Coruscant during the Clone Wars. Unfortunately for them, this was only a taste of what was to come after the war's end. On the last day of the Clone Wars, as the Confederacy of Independent Systems fell apart and the Great Jedi Purge began, the Galactic Republic became the Galactic Empire, and one of the darkest chapters of galactic history began. Coruscant, the capital of the Republic from its founding, became the capital of the Empire, and it was renamed accordingly. From 19 BBY to 7 ABY, Coruscant was officially renamed to Imperial Center, while Galactic City was renamed to Imperial City. Most everyday working-class Coruscanti continued to call the planet Coruscant, as did rebels and other opponents of the Empire, but the old name was purged from all official records, and Imperial Center, at any rate, was a fairly fitting name for what the planet became during this period. Imperial Center was the dark heart of the Empire, a place of corruption and oppression. It was the home of the Imperial Senate and the Emperor himself, who ruled from the towering new Imperial Palace, as well as numerous military installations, weapons depots, and laboratories. New shipyards were constructed in orbit above the planet for the Imperial Navy, and vast fleets of Star Destroyers would often mass above Imperial Center as a show of force. Some of these fleets were so massive that they eclipsed the sun for parts of Imperial City, plunging the city into literal as well as figurative darkness. This effect was amplified by a new grid of overlapping shields the Emperor had installed all across Imperial City. Where these shields overlapped, they created atmospheric patterns that caused regular thunderstorms. This meant that much of Imperial Center was subjected to constant gloomy skies, matching the mood of most of the people who lived there. Imperial Center was also the heart of the Empire's police state, which was at its strongest on the galactic capital. The planet was doused in constant hollow feeds of Imperial propaganda, and its streets were stalked by spies from the ISB and Imperial intelligence. Shortly after the declaration of a new order, the Emperor personally ordered the installation of over 1 million new surveillance systems across Imperial City, augmenting the already massive surveillance network installed during the Clone Wars. Very little happened on Imperial Center without the Emperor's secret police knowing about it. Most dissidents on the planet were caught very quickly as a result. Some of these were simply executed, while others were hauled off to the secret prison Imperial intelligence built on the planet during the Galactic Civil War, known only as Yuuzhan'tar. In this prison, run by Director of Imperial Intelligence Yuuzhan'tar, detainees were tortured until their minds broke, following which they would be rendered catatonic or converted into sleeper agents working for the Empire. Very few of the people imprisoned in Yuuzhan'tar emerged with their minds intact. Despite the Empire's enormous surveillance network in Imperial City, however, many ordinary lawbreakers continued to get away scot-free so long as they were human. The underlevels of Imperial Center remained a thriving hub of the galaxy's black market, even more than they had been under the Republic. Spice, banned artwork, and even slaves could all be acquired easily on Imperial Center if one knew where to look, and these illegal goods were hoarded by the planet's well-to-do, with slaves especially kept as status symbols despite the Empire's nominal slavery bans. This was not only known to Imperial authorities, but to the Emperor himself, who authorized this illicit trade to give himself an easy way of blackmailing Imperial Center's wealthy and powerful if he ever needed it. The Emperor even gave Imperial Center's leading spice dealer, the rich socialite Wendell Wright Sims, express permission to sell his product in Imperial City. All of these illegal activities were dominated by the human elite, but despite this, crime on Imperial Center was usually blamed on non-humans who were severely persecuted during the Imperial era. The speciest policies implemented during the Clone Wars were expanded toward the war's end to target all non-humans, and during the Dark Times, they intensified until finally all non-humans on Imperial Center were forcibly removed from most of the city, packed into walled-off, segregated districts. These were officially called Alien Protection Zones, as the Empire claimed their purpose was to protect Imperial Center's non-human population from hate crimes. But this was nonsense, and transparently so. Colloquially, these segregated districts were known as invisible sectors, and they were kept isolated from the rest of Imperial City by constant stormtrooper patrols. Those who lived there were kept dirt poor and subjected to constant harassment from stormtroopers. All these repressive measures were meant to bring Imperial Center under the absolute control of the Emperor. In the end, however, they had quite the opposite effect. While they were successful in preventing any large-scale rebel activities on the galactic capital during the early stages of the Galactic Civil War, the Empire's repressive policies ultimately turned the Coruscanti population against it. In 4 ABY, after the Battle of Endor and the death of the Emperor, this led to a massive, spontaneous uprising in Imperial City. Billions of people took to the streets to celebrate the death of the Emperor, attacking and overwhelming Imperial military patrols and seizing control of several sectors, including Monument Plaza. The non-human populations took up arms and broke out of the invisible sectors, and all across the city, statues of Palpatine and monuments to the Empire were defaced or torn down. Fireworks lit up the night skies, and the Imperial authorities were thrown into complete disarray. But this uprising was short-lived. As soon as it began, Yuuzhan'tar and other Imperial authorities declared martial law, giving the Imperial military broad authority to put down the uprising by any means possible. The revelers were massacred by Imperial troops, who rounded up and arrested numerous others. Many of the arrestees, from the ringleaders of the insurrection to everyone who set off fireworks, were sent before firing squads for execution. Within a matter of weeks, the uprising had been utterly quashed, and Imperial Center was once more under firm Imperial control, more repressive than ever before. In the years that followed the Battle of Endor, the Empire's grip on the galaxy faltered. The death of the Emperor and many top Imperial officers at Endor left a power vacuum, and many of those at the top of the Imperial military hierarchy declared themselves the rightful rulers of the Empire, becoming little more than warlords. As the Empire splintered into feuding fiefdoms, Imperial Center came under the control of Grand Vizier Sate Pestage, the highest-ranking survivor of the Imperial Court. Pestage, who had already been the one doing most of the day-to-day work of ruling the Empire for years, declared himself the new Emperor, but his claim was widely contested. The Grand Vizier retained control of Imperial Center and many of the core worlds, but most of the Empire's military leaders refused to acknowledge his authority since he was a politician and not one of them, which left Pestage without significant military support. Even on Imperial Center, Pestage had rivals. Many of the Emperor's surviving advisors, known as the Inner Circle, plotted against him, and though Yuuzhan'tar acted as an intermediary between the two sides, she secretly plotted against them both, hoping to seize control of the Empire for herself. Thus, between 4 ABY and 7 ABY, Imperial Center was a den of intrigue. Isard, Pistage, and the Circle all spent most of their time scheming against each other, while the population was kept in line with unreserved brutality. This repression was ultimately only a temporary measure. The population had irrevocably turned against the Empire, and massacres carried out against the revelers only made the Empire more enemies. The people of Coruscant would continue to yearn for freedom from Imperial rule, and eventually they would get it. In 7 ABY, after a series of campaigns that won it control of much of the core, the New Republic finally moved to wrest the galactic capital from Imperial control. After Rogue Squadron sabotaged Imperial Center's planetary shield generator, Admiral Akbar led an enormous New Republic fleet to the planet, where it ultimately bested Imperial Center's much-reduced home fleet. Imperial forces ultimately abandoned the planet, with Yuuzhan'tar making a particularly dramatic escape in the Lusankia. This infamous facility turned out not to be a prison at all, but a super star destroyer that had been buried under Imperial City. Isard and her minions used it as their escape craft, and as the Lusankia took off, it obliterated 100 square miles of city blocks, killing millions of people. The Star Dreadnought fled to orbit and escaped into hyperspace, and with its departure, Imperial Center, soon to be renamed back to Coruscant, came under the control of the New Republic, which claimed the planet as its capital. The New Republic didn't remain in control of Coruscant for very long, however, as detailed in our last story. In 27 ABY, just 20 short years after the liberation of Coruscant, the galactic capital was conquered by the Yuuzhan'tar during their invasion of the galaxy. In the face of the Vong's enormous invasion fleet, the New Republic was forced to abandon the planet. Galactic City suffered tremendously during the attack, bombarded from orbit by Vong ships, and once New Republic forces fled, the planet came under Vong occupation. Much of Galactic City was reduced to ruins and billions of people were killed. The full story of the Yuuzhan War is worth a video of its own, and we'll stay away from the details here because our focus for this last story is one particular aspect of the war: the Vong's attempted terraforming of Coruscant. The Yuuzhan didn't just see Coruscant as a prize, as the enemy's captured capital. They wanted to transform it into a new homeworld for their people. They renamed it Yuuzhan'tar after their original homeworld, and they undertook an enormous Vong-forming project on the planet meant to remake it into the Yuuzhan'tar's image. The original Yuuzhan'tar was a jungle world, so this was a pretty big undertaking. The Vong began by altering the planet's orbit, bringing it closer to Coruscant Prime to raise Yuuzhan'tar's surface temperature. They relocated the planet's 3 smallest moons and destroyed the largest one, which they converted into a brilliant ring system to match the original Yuuzhan'tar's rings. As these rings resembled an enormous rainbow in the night sky from the planet's surface, they were known as the Rainbow Bridge by the Vong. The Vong released vast amounts of moisture into the planet's atmosphere to make the planet more humid, and they seeded flora and fauna from their galaxy of origin across the city's upper levels. Urban canyons were transformed into rivers, skyscrapers were overtaken by crawling vines, and before long, a thick layer of vegetation covered what was once the highest levels of Galactic City. This process was overseen by a world brain, which was installed in the ruins of the Senate building. As the upper levels of Galactic City were converted into a jungle, the planet's population retreated into the lower levels of the city, nicknamed the Necropolis, which were less affected by the Vong forming. These levels were effectively buried under the Vong's new jungle, but they were still habitable, though they saw an influx of animals from the Vong galaxy that the Vong had released across Yuuzhan'tar. These survivors formed a resistance movement, fighting back against the intergalactic invaders that now called the galactic capital home. The Yuuzhan dramatically transformed Coruscant, but their occupation of the planet didn't last. Just 2 years after the fall of Coruscant, the living planet Zonama Sikot, an offspring of the original Yuuzhan'tar, arrived in the skies above the captured galactic capital at the behest of Luke Skywalker. Its arrival destabilized the Rainbow Bridge, ejected one of the planet's moons from orbit, and relocated Coruscant back to its original orbit. Ground quakes rocked the planet, and shortly thereafter, the Yuuzhan'tar surrendered, ending the Vong War. Coruscant was reclaimed by the Galactic Alliance, the successor of the New Republic, and became the capital of the galaxy once more. But the Yuuzhan'tar left a lasting impact on Coruscant. Galactic City was rebuilt, and much of the jungle was cleared away. Those who had been forced into the necropolis were eventually able to return to their homes on the higher levels. Some aspects of the Vong forming operation were left in place, however. The world brain was kept as is, and the Senate building was rebuilt elsewhere, while many skyscrapers retained the curtains of vegetation the Vong had draped them in. Galactic City went back to having a primarily urban landscape, but on the whole, it was greener than it had been before. Additionally, part of the Rainbow Bridge survived the gravitational disruptions caused by Zonama Sekot. This remnant was renamed the Rings of Coruscant and became a popular tourist attraction, appearing prominently in Coruscant's night sky at certain latitudes. In the end, Coruscant was arguably improved a little by the Vong forming process, something that couldn't be said for a great many other Vong-formed worlds. So those were 10 stories from Coruscant, the capital of the galaxy, from the depths of Star Wars legends. But what do you think? Would you be interested in seeing more videos like this in the future? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.